Hello, professors. Today, I'll be sharing my findings on the involvement of international organizations and their effectiveness when it comes to Palestinian statehood. In particular, I'll look at the League of Nations and its successor, the United Nations. Now, what is statehood? The conditions for statehood have two types of theories according to KS think tank: declarative and constitutive. For most countries, under the declarative umbrella, the Montevideo Convention applies. This only requires them to declare that they are a state, and does not need other states to recognize them as such. However, it must fulfill four criteria, which is having a permanent population and having a government, among other things. In 2024, the International Criminal Court declared that Palestine can be recognized as a state on the territory of which Israeli war crimes occurred. It used the principle of self determination to decide this, but some countries do not conflate this with statehood. The sense of dispute is also seen in the second theory, known as the constitutive theory, as states have to recognize another state before it is decided to be a state. Next, why should one even look at international organizations? Firstly, there are many organs that have been involved in setting the norms as well as the territorial claims which Palestine can make. Moving on to how it can influence international peace through the setting of international laws as well as norms. International laws can be found in things like the UN Charter as well as the UN Declaration of Human Rights. They also set norms through their decisions, as seen from how the League of Nations, by granting the British mandate, suggested that Palestinians were not fit enough to run their own government, and this perception continues until today. But finally, the limitations of international organizations can show the power dynamics between countries and how this affects whether countries can come to conclusions and decisions when it comes to issues such as Palestine. Now, I'll briefly go into a timeline of the events when international organizations were involved. Although the Balfour Declaration was not created by an international organization, it is largely intertwined with the British Mandate for Palestine because the British Mandate allowed the British to change laws in Palestine that would actually facilitate the creation of a Jewish homeland. Later, in 1947 and 1948, when the British Mandate ended, there was the start of the Nakba, or catastrophe from Arabic, and this was largely due to the UN General Assembly that granted 56% of Palestine to the Jewish population. 1948 to 1946 was when the Nakba ended, and there was a UN brokered truce, under which the UNTSO was deployed. In 1967, there was a six-day war between some Arab states and Israel, and this was when SE 242 was passed by the UNSC. In the 2000s, the violence has not stopped. However, there have been some improvements in terms of international recognition of Palestine, such as the UN General Assembly's vote to recognize Palestine's statehood and to grant them full membership. How I will evaluate the efficacy of these international organizations are through, firstly, the fairness of the organization's regulations, and secondly, whether they have come up with solutions and enforced them in Palestine. Now, moving on to the League of Nations. I'll look at the covenants of the League of Nations first, which was created during a time where colonialism was the norm. This hence introduced the mandate system, which was tied to the Article 22 that granted members the trusteeship of former Ottoman territories that included Palestine. The mandate system was largely influenced by the colonial mindset that they were of greater advancement as well as civilization as compared to the territories which they would take over in order to govern them until they were fit to govern themselves. However, Article 23b would suggest that these colonial powers in the LON would treat the native people fairly. Nonetheless, as seen from the case of Palestine, where the rest of the communities were given only civil and religious rights, while the Jewish community was favored and given national and political rights, shows how the colonial master is basically given free rein as to how they alter the laws in order to support their own political objectives. This can be analyzed through the lens of post-colonial theory, which states that inequalities in political power in the present day can be traced to the colonial period. Although in the past, Jewish immigration was portrayed as bringing benefits such as economic benefits to the natives in Palestine, now Israel's settler colonialism is hailed by Western governments as the only democracy in the Middle East. Next, I'll consider the UN. Firstly, through its foundational documents. The UN Declaration of Human Rights, or UNDHR, was said by Ariella Azoulay to be largely towards the prerogative of the powerful states. So when there was an Iraqi delegate in the drafting process who pushed for the Nakba, which was going on at the same time to be addressed, he was sidelined, and this led to the perception that the UNDHR was fixated on abstract principles rather than addressing real human rights violations. This reflects the realist perception that states are self interested and power maximizers, and even through the laws that they create, they are only doing so in order to further their own political objectives. As for the UN Charter, there were articles that were violated, such as how all members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. Despite Article 2 of the UN Charter and many other articles that have been violated by Israel, it was nonetheless admitted to the UN in 1949, only 4 years after the drafting of the UN Charter. This leads me to a criticism of liberalism because it claims that international laws and cooperation can prevail between states rather than assuming that states are constantly trying to undermine each other. And this is because of the lack of effective action that has been taken against aggressors in Palestine. Now, I'll move on to the UN Security Council, which is an important organ because it is the primary organ that can take measures in response to aggressors, such as economic and military sanctions. It was involved first during the UN Truth Supervision Organization that was deployed as a peacekeeping mission. While this was an attempt to increase the peace in the region, this was mostly a mitigative one because it did not address the root problem that was the fact that territory was being taken away from Palestine. On the other hand, the SC242 resolution, which was passed to resolve the Six-Day War, implicitly accepted the occupation of Palestinian territory, which Israel had undergone, because it accepted the armistice lines of the Nakba. It was also largely driven by the superpower interests of the USA because at the time of the Cold War, it saw Israel as a very important counterbalance to the Soviet leaning Arab states. In the current day, we see a lack of resolution between the permanent members of the UNSC in how to draft a resolution for a ceasefire in Gaza. For example, a resolution that was proposed and supported by Russia was vetoed by the USA. On the other hand, a resolution that was suggested by the USA was vetoed by Russia and China. This shows, again, how great power competition as well as realism can explain the outcomes in the attempts by the UN to reach solutions in Palestine. Finally, I'll touch briefly on the International Court of Justice. Although it is non-binding, they have significant symbolic power, and they're also important as a potential area of progress because past Israeli actions have been shielded by legal means. The ICJ rejected Israel justifying its actions in the West Bank in 2004 as self-defense, for example, so this ensures that member states do not interpret international laws based on their own interests. ICJ also ruled that Israel must take all actions to prevent genocide in Gaza and actually recognize the fact that Israel could be plausibly committing genocide in Gaza. However, the non-binding nature of ICJ's rulings are its key weakness. For example, it only required Israel to ensure that no actions that would lead to genocide would be taken, as well as having repercussions for those who incited genocide, such as its politicians. Nonetheless, its politicians have continued to show open support towards Israeli military actions. For example, key ministers such as Ben Gvir as well as Yoav Gallant have leveled accusations towards the ICJ, even ridiculing them to turn the international opinion against them. This refusal by Israel to listen to the ICJ can be explained through the constructivist view, which is how states are largely the ones who determine the strength of international law when it is not enforced. It's largely up to the states and how much they wish to adhere to these laws. I believe that the international organizations have not been effective. Nonetheless, there has been progress as seen in the ICJ and the General Assembly in favor of the Palestinians, but whether this results in action remains to be seen. According to the words of diplomat and Nobel Peace Prize winner Ralph Bunche, no problem of human relations is insoluble.